Behalf of Knox County Schools and the Socialist Department, let me welcome all of you. I am Brandon O'Neill, a socialist teacher at Fulton High School, and this is part 4 and the final part of the KCS at Home Summer Activity Set for U.S. History. This video is designed to provide you with a brief introduction and overview of the task you will complete. The purpose of these tasks are to allow you the opportunity to learn the content from U.S. history that you may have missed out on due to the onset of COVID-19. In this case, our focus is on modern U.S. history, so from 1970 to the present, which we are almost certain almost all of you will have missed out on because of the virus. So before we begin, let's review some of the options in case you have problems understanding the video. So we're kind of walking through the same procedures that we have the last 3 activity sets. So if you are having trouble understanding the video, of course, you have number 1, you can turn on and close captions if available. Number 2, adjust the playback speed to slow down the video. Number 3, consider watching short clips, then pause, listen, and watch again. And then, of course, ask someone in your house, your home, to watch the video with you. Stop frequently and talk to your partner about what you heard and understood. So once again, in particular, if English happens to be your second language, these are some options that you have if you are having trouble understanding the video. Okay. So this is the final activity set in your summer edition, as I said. This part of U.S. history we're looking at is the most recent. It's the modern United States history. And so if you look at some of the pictures here on this first slide, you're going to probably recognize some pictures. And if you look on the right, of course, all of you will recognize the headline, Obama Makes History. It's a reference to Barack Obama winning the election in 2008. Of course, you've got a picture here of the 9/11 towers coming down. You've got Richard Nixon resigning in a headline that's related to the Watergate scandal. You've got below that Jimmy Carter, and then in the middle here you've got Ronald Reagan and George HW Bush. They were presidents in the 80s and 90s. And then below that you actually have a picture from the environmentalist movement from the 1970s. So this activity set is going to be kind of different just because the time frame we're looking at is so big, and it's almost impossible to really give a comprehensive look, but we're going to give it our best shot. So kind of like the last activity sets, we're going to look at some context first. So modern United States history, we're talking about 1970 to the present. So that is quite literally 50 years worth of history. It's a lot of time, and of course, a lot of things happened during that time period. So from the 1970s to the present, the U.S. has undergone vast changes in its politics, economy, culture, and society. These tasks will provide a broad overview of some of the key factors that have led the U.S. to where it is today. That's kind of a really important point we want you to keep in mind with this last set, is that history is important because of the way it has led to our present, the way it has facilitated the lives we live today, the world we live in today. Our present is very much a consequence of our past. And of course, by studying history, it allows us to make hopefully better decisions in the future. So especially looking at these most recent events of the last 50 years, it should be pretty easy to try to draw some connections between these events and the world we see today, our present. So your essential question kind of hits off that, where it says, how has modern U.S. history affected the lives of American citizens today? And the tasks that you have been assigned are kind of designed to really focus on that question. We've tried to put together tasks that are really important in terms of understanding where the United States is today, politically, economically, culturally, and its society. So your first task is going to be a Google Hyperdoc, and the Hyperdoc is going to be kind of about everything in the 1970s. So the Hyperdoc will kind of cover this pretty momentous decade. As you see on the slide, it says the 1970s was a time of dramatic political and cultural change. It's a time of, hippies, as all of you, hippies kind of begin in the 60s, but it's in the 70s where they really kind of come into their own. So you'll learn about hippies in the Hyperdoc. The Hyperdoc is going to be focused primarily on the presidency of Richard Nixon, though. So Richard Nixon was president from 1969 to 1974. He does resign the presidency in 1974 because of the most significant political scandal in American history called the Watergate scandal. So in the hyperdoc, you're learn more about why he resigns and kind of the scandal that happened and his role in it. But you're also learning about some of the good things that Nixon did and some of his accomplishments. Besides the Watergate scandal, he had some real accomplishments. He had created the Clean Water Act, the Clean Air Act. He opened up relations with China. Nixon had a record that was a lot of historians today look back on it with fondly. So you're going to learn about the kind of the good, bad, and the ugly with Nixon in this hyperdoc. Also in the hyperdoc, it will cover the presidency of Jimmy Carter as well. Jimmy Carter was president from 1977 to 1981. He was a Democrat from Georgia, and Carter only served one term, and you'll be kind of looking at why that was. He had a very eventful one term as president. Did some good things, had a lot of good ideas in many respects, but he definitely struggled and had a lot of setbacks as well. Okay. So real quick, I'll just show you the Google Hyperdoc. So you're going to see it's the very first task. So I'm going to click on it here. Now, you did a hyperdoc if you did the Cold War activity set. That was what you looked at to kind of start the Cold War. And so when you pull up the hyperdoc, of course, you're going to make your own copy. But after that, once you've got your own copy, you're going to type your answers down right in the hyperdoc itself. So for instance, to do this first part, you would type it in right here, and then you would move down. Each section of the hyperdoc looks at kind of a different aspect of the 1970s. So you see this first section here, it's Nixon and the silent majority. The silent majority refers to a speech and kind of a phrase he used to describe what was kind of like his political base, those who supported him. And so you'll look at an article kind of related to that speech. Below that, you're going to look at a lot of his accomplishments. As I said, he does have real accomplishments, both in foreign policy and in domestic policy. So using the Richard Nixon Foundation, you'll get to look at some of those achievements and kind of examine just his entire record. And then, of course, you'll get to the Watergate scandal, and you'll be looking at both a clip and an article that has some questions related to it. And you'll kind of get an idea of why Nixon is remembered, frankly, with a certain amount of disdain today because of the way he abused his office with this scandal. And then your last two sections here, you've got one very, very quick section on the hippies, and then finally, of course, Jimmy Carter. And then you're going to have a short conclusion. And it's basically just kind of your opportunity to reflect on the 1970s. And so the hyperdoc is kind of a good way to cover an extended amount of time or extended events like this. And so given everything that's gone in the 70s, it was a good way for us to try to provide you an opportunity to look at a broad variety of things. So looking back at this, you're also going to do task number 2 is a timeline analysis, and that's going to be about the environmental movement. So I'm going to go ahead and pull that up here, task 2. You're actually going to use a timeline from the EPA website. And so the EPA stands for the Environmental Protection Agency, and in fact, it's an agency that, as its name implies, is designed to protect the environment, but also to protect humans from the environment as well, to ensure, for instance, that we have clean air and clean water. It was created by Nixon, and so when you open it up, you're going to have a few questions, just 5 of them, and these questions primarily look at some key events that led to the environmental movement, where you see an organized movement of people and organizations who were trying to really advocate on behalf of environmentally friendly policies. I'm going to pull up the timeline just for a moment so you can see it here. So when you pull it up, as you see, this comes from the EPA's official website, and it's called Milestones in EPA and Environmental History. And then as you go through the timeline here, you're going to see there's arrows on the right, and this will allow you to go to different events. The first question you have will actually be about this book, Rachel Carson's book called Silent Spring. Many historians kind of consider this book to be the beginning of the environmental movement. Some of the other events are further on the timeline. You can also use the bottom of the timeline here, and it will allow you to move farther forward in history. And you can kind of see a bunch of different events at once. And then you can pick the events you need based on the questions that are asked. Okay. Let me go back on the slides now. Okay, so moving forward from the 1970s, you're going to kind of move into the 1980s now, and you're going to look at the 2 presidents who kind of ushered in a new conservative era of government. So you see it says a new conservative era of government was ushered in upon the election of Ronald Reagan in 1980, in many respects as a reaction to the liberal reforms that began in the 1960s. Reagan emphasized limited government and sought to return more power to state and local governments. Reagan and his vice president, George H.W. Bush, were both Republicans. Reagan had been a governor of California, and before that, he'd actually been a Hollywood actor, did a lot of Westerns. And Reagan made a name for himself in the 60s and 70s as a governor by kind of taking a hard nose on crime, calling for a war on drugs. But most importantly for him is he wanted to try to scale down government. So he emphasized limited government, small government, trying to reinforce the power of state and local governments as opposed to the federal government. And this was kind of a reaction to a lot of the very liberal reforms passed by some of the presidents in the 60s and 70s. And so when Reagan leaves office in 1989, his vice president, George H.W. Bush, he actually becomes president. So these two are back to back. You see he's listed here as Bush 41. That's because his son, George W. Bush, became president as well. And so his son is often called Bush 43. And we use the numbers because 41, because George H.W. Bush was the 41st president, and his son, George W. Bush, was the 43rd. So Bush 41 and Bush 43 are just a ways to differentiate them from each other. For these two, you're going to be doing an activity where you're going to be looking at presidential report cards. So let me pull up the activity for you. This is task number 3 out of 5. And so you're going to see that there's going to be 2 tables here. You got one for Reagan. You see it lists off his time as president, 1981, 1989. And then the next page, you're going to have the one for his successor, George H.W. Bush. And you see he was only president for 4 years, for 1 term. In the table, you're going to see that there is 3 different columns: foreign policy, domestic policy, and setbacks. And what you're going to do is you're going to read some text, an article, and you're basically going to kind of use bullet points to kind of summarize Reagan's record on foreign policy, his record on domestic policy, and then also some setbacks that he had in his presidency. And then you'll do the same thing for George H.W. Bush. And in order for you to do this, we've included a link here. You see it. This link will take you to the text that you need. So I'm going to click on it, and you're going to see it actually is the text that comes up is kind of a report card. And it summarizes Reagan on foreign policy, very much about the Cold War and the fall of the Berlin Wall. His record on domestic policy, you see Reaganomics. That's kind of reference to his economic policies. He was very big on cutting taxes, the war on drugs, and then his setbacks. This is the Lebanon bombing and the Iran-Contra scandal. And then below that, you got the information for Bush. You know, his record on foreign policy, his record on domestic policy, particularly the Americans with Disabilities Act, which is an incredibly important law that's passed and that is actually as hugely relevant to us today. And then some of his setbacks, which as you'll find out, his setbacks will eventually lead to him being defeated in his bid to win re-election. So using this information, you'll fill out the table, and then you'll see at the bottom of each column, there's a grade. And what we want you to do is just to kind of take a moment to evaluate Reagan and then evaluate Bush. You know, how good of a president do you think they were? And then grade them, kind of A to F, the way your teachers would grade you. And just make sure that you put A to F and kind of justify it. So, you know, if you think Reagan was great on foreign policy, put him an A, you know, and kind of tell us why. You know, if you think his domestic policy was an A or something lower, then tell us that as well. So try to take a moment, use the text, and really kind of evaluate these guys. What is it about their records that was good? What is it that was bad? You'll see that as, you know, all presidents, you know, they all have kind of their strengths and they all have kind of their weaknesses. But all of them are important and significant in their own way. So moving forward, we're actually going to move forward into the 2000s here with our 4th task. Your 4th task is going to be a web quest, and it's going to be about definitely the most consequential event in U.S. history, probably in many ways since World War II, and it is the terrorist attacks on September 11th in 2001. The terrorist attacks were carried out by an organization called Al-Qaeda, and Al-Qaeda launched 4 suicide attacks using airliners. And they targeted various buildings and structures in the United States. 2 of them hit the World Trade Center towers in New York City. A 3rd hit the Pentagon in Washington, D.C. And then a 4th one crash landed in a field in Pennsylvania. To this day, we're still not entirely sure what target the 4th one was supposed to have, but we think it could have been the White House or maybe the Capitol building, we're just not sure what its target was. But in the case of the fourth plane, the passengers on board fought back, and they saved a lot of lives by what happened. 9/11, it's, for those of us that kind of lived through it, 9/11 had a huge impact on us. A lot of us, most of us who were living at that time, remember exactly where we were when we found out about the attacks. And, most of this stuff took place on the news. And in fact, in the web quest you're going to look at, you're going to get a chance to watch some clips related to the news coverage at the time. In many ways, the country was traumatized by what happened on September 11th, and the impact of what happened would be felt for years on end, and can still be felt today. It led to um, a lot of military action, but also led to some significant impacts on internally in the United States, domestically. And so the web quest you'll do is kind of designed to focus on the impact itself. So I'm going to pull it up here. We have done web quest before, but you're going to have a series of different links that you're going to use to answer these questions. And so we've got four different links here. And these 4 links will allow you to answer the different questions that we've put together. The first one is actually a timeline of the 9/11 memorial. And it's basically going to ask you to kind of look through the timeline and then summarize the events that happened. And so question number 1 is really much more about trying to make sure that you understand just what did happen on 9/11. After that, your next section 2 and 3 will get much more into kind of who attacked the United States and why. Your third section right here, these are questions 4 through 7, will look much more directly at the impact itself, both in terms of our foreign policy, but our domestic policy. Okay, finally, the last activity you'll do, the last task, is going to be the most recent. It actually is a reference to the very last standard in U.S. history, which is on Barack Obama, on his presidency. So, of course, we all know that Barack Obama is the first African-American president in American history. And given the history of race relations in America, that's not a small thing. In fact, it's an incredibly significant thing and a milestone in many respects, given our history on race. The activity you're going to do is going to be called a timeline quest using a website called Proceedin. And so what we've done, let me pull it up here for you. Okay, what we've done is you're going to notice that it kind of looks similar to a Google Map quest. You've got a series of questions, and the questions will tell you what to highlight on the timeline. So you're going to see several of them ask about the election, the American Recovery Act, first Latinx Supreme Court Justice, and so forth. The timeline you're going to use is right here. Here's the link for you. Now you can use the timeline in some different ways here. So you're going to see all the different events that you need are listed on the timeline, and they're in order. So if you see horizontally at the top, you see the years. Obama was president from 2009 to 2017. You're going to see the first event is actually a little before that because that's a reference to his election. In order to read about the event in question, all you need to do is highlight the event. But what you can also do if you want is if you scroll to the bottom, you're going to see all the events are listed vertically. So you see, and you can just actually go down vertically each time and read all through the events. With this activity, you're going to notice that Barack Obama had a number of achievements. He accomplished a lot of the goals that he had in mind, but he also had a lot of setbacks too. Some things that didn't go his way and some things that prevented him from accomplishing a lot of his goals. Barack Obama his presidency in many respects is dominated, certainly in his first term, by the economy. He inherited the Great Recession, and the Great Recession was the worst economy we've had since the Great Depression. And it was due to a financial crisis. And so his first term in particular is very much kind of focused on the economic impact from the Great Recession. He also inherited the Iraq War, the Afghanistan War, and numerous other problems. So as you're working your way through these events, try to keep in mind the issues he faced, and then of course what his record is. Okay. So those are the 5 tasks you're going to be doing for this final activity set. Once again, just to make sure that we kind of keep everything in focus, as you're going through these events, try to keep in mind what the essential question is. Your essential question is, how has modern U.S. history affected the lives of American citizens today? And these tasks have all been kind of designed to lead you to that point. So what has the Watergate scandal, how has it affected, presidential scandals today? What about the environmental laws that we saw passed in the 1970s? How has that impacted the environment we have today, the air we breathe, the water we drink? What impact has there been on the U.S. economy and U.S. policies due to the reforms made by Ronald Reagan and George H.W. Bush? What impact has 9/11 had on our domestic security, on our national security, on the military? And of course, what impact has Barack Obama had and his presidency had on the U.S. today? On behalf of Knox County Schools and the Socialist Department, we would like to thank you for spending time in your summer. And we all know that given the stress we're under with COVID-19, we all have a lot of things on our mind. But for taking the time during your summer to try to improve yourself and complete your education and expose yourself to this content and try to get a full comprehensive view of U.S. history from start to finish, we thank you. And we definitely think you did the smart thing, and we're proud of you. Yeah, thank you.